So as I said, for those that have joined us, thank you and welcome. The numbers are growing as we speak. We've got about 40 of you tuning in already, and that is growing by the second. So we'll just give people another 30 seconds or so to join us, and we'll provide as much information as we can on our plans in relation to returning to school. We're up to the 70 mark, so we've got lots of people joining us this afternoon, which is great. I've got all members of the principal team here to assist me with this afternoon's information briefing, and we'll be throwing it around and sharing the information around as a team. So we're almost ready to start. We're getting close to 100 people have joined us in a short space of time, so no pressure to the assistant principals who are sitting over to my left. Okay, let's get started. So thanks everyone for taking some time out to join us this afternoon. We wanted to give you as much information as we could to provide you with a bit of an update on what's happening in relation to returning to school. Can I start by saying, despite the fact that the Minister and the Premier had a press conference this morning at 7:45, unfortunately, we didn't receive any formal communication from the department until after lunch. So we've only had a couple of hours really to discuss as a principal team and as a staff what some of those plans might be. So there'll be more information coming in the following days that I think will answer a lot of your questions and a lot of the questions that you might have. We may not be able to answer this evening. We'll do our best. But those questions that you might have that we can't answer, we'll take on notice and try and answer in the coming days. So what I would ask, these live sessions work best when people put their questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them. In the absence of any questions to start, I might start off by talking about the plans for what happens when students return, and I might throw it up open to the assistant principals, so I'm just giving them a bit of notice. So I might throw to Catherine Ford in a minute to talk about when year 11s and 12s are going back and how that first week is going to work, with the curriculum day being on that first day, and then I might throw to Mr Kruger to talk about when year 7 to 10 students are going back and how that applies. And George's question already is about VCE students going back 5 days a week. So, Catherine, I might start wandering over to you. The first question to you is the plans for a return to school for VCE students, and whether year 11s and 12s are going back 5 days a week, or are they going back gradually? Over to you.
So, hi everyone. It's really exciting. So the 25th of May we'll be having a student-free day where we'll have all teachers back, and they'll be back preparing for the return of students as they make their transition from remote learning to classroom teaching. On the 26th, we'll have our year 11 and 12 students back, and from that date they'll be back full-time, back at school, doing their classes. So we'll be running the timetable as per normal for students, so it will be your normal compass timetable. For those students who are in year 10 and doing a VCE subject, we will be having you guys back for your VCE subject. The rest of your classes will be occurring by remote for 2 weeks until year 10s come back. If you need to do your remote at school, we'll make that available to you. Otherwise, you'll be able to just come and go for your VCE classes.
Okay. I will ask those struggling to hear, so maybe if we talk nice and loud, hopefully at this volume, people will be able to hear. So I think most of you hopefully heard that. So just to perhaps a quick recap, nice and loud, of what you said then, Catherine.
So 25th, we will be having back our teachers, where they will prepare to transition from remote learning to classroom-based learning. Our year 11 and 12 students will be back 5 days a week from the 26th onwards, and you will have your normal compass timetable. Our year 10 students who do a VCE subject, they will be coming in for their VCE subjects and then leaving school, or if that's not convenient, we'll be able to provide a place for them to do their remote learning at school.
Thank you, and over to Shane now. Shane, if you can give us a bit of an update on what are the plans at this stage for the return of Year 7 students, 8, 9 and 10s?
Okay, so welcome everyone. So what we're going to be looking at, as you probably heard, those students don't return till the 9th of June, which is another 2 weeks after our Year 11s and 12 students return. So basically it's business as usual, what students have currently been doing. So they'll be provided with remote learning. The same timetable they've been working with at home will still be in place. Expectations are there will be some live sessions as normal, where teachers will notify students when those live sessions will be, and will be online to support students. And the current practice of, if students have questions and they want to contact their teachers, they can do that via Teams or via email, and we'll still give our teachers the 24 hours notice to get back to students if they need. They'll be returning on the 9th of June, and then they'll be transitioning back into the face-to-face teaching with their normal timetable.
Good question here for Susie, and I might throw it over to you, Mr. Lewis, and it's in relation to the different timetables that Year 7 to 10 students will have versus Year 11 to 12 students. And Susie's question, which is part of that, is this going to cause a problem if the Year 10s miss an online class while in transit to school? Perhaps if you can give us a bit of information about how the two different timetables will work and the impact on Year 10s if they're coming and going.
So the two different timetables should be able to work pretty well seamlessly together. That's how we originally designed it, apart from period 4, which is sometimes will be a little bit different for the at-home period, but there should be work left by the staff who are running that sort of program in that time. For students who are going back and forth for Year 10s, if they are having difficulty, they take a long time to move back and forth, there will be a spot at school that they can be sitting and doing their work here at school, so they can spend the day at school, do the double period or single, whatever it happens to be, and then spend the rest of the time at school doing their remote learning from school if they want to. But so hopefully we won't have too much time in it transitioning from place to place, but they may miss some of the time. That's certainly true if they do take a while to do the transition from home to school and then back to home again if they've got a period like that. We will work as much as we can, and we know that the at-home time is a little bit less than the at-school time, but we'll have to work with that and see how we go. It's a bit of a situation we'll deal with it on an individual basis, so if you just happen to live around the corner, there'll be no problem. If you live a bit further away, it might be worth considering whether it's worth staying at school for an extra period, say till lunchtime, when you're going to have a bit longer break, rather than at some other time in the day.
Tane had a question about will production rehearsals go back to normal once everyone is back?
Well, we're still waiting for a little bit of advice upon that. We've got some advice from the department, which is basically the same sort of material as the Premier and the Minister spoke about this morning. They've promised us another piece of advice on some other issues, and we're still awaiting that advice before we could possibly make a definitive statement about that. We'd love to hope that that would be the case, but we're waiting for some further advice before we're prepared to gather in a group of the size of the production team in that way at the moment. Probably we'll have to see what happens there.
Thank you. I'm coming down the end. We haven't heard from Ms Wallace yet. Ms Wallace, we've got a question from Abby about students who weren't coping with online learning and perhaps their struggle to re-engage. Can you talk to us about what will learning look like for students, particularly in their first week that they're back in normal classes?
Yeah, I think it's been a huge transition for students and teachers to go to remote learning, and I think the transition back into classroom teaching for all of us is going to be difficult. And I think that it's really important that we spend some time re-engaging, reconnecting and getting used to our new environment again. So we're going to be spending lots of time in classes, talking and sharing, looking at what's happened, acknowledging what's happened, and spending time to work through some of those issues. Teachers aren't going to be starting their first class back talking about what learning tasks are due or what learning tasks haven't or have been done. Our real focus is going to be around student wellbeing and teacher wellbeing, and making sure that we can together get back into classroom teaching and get to know each other in this new environment again.
Seems to be lots of hearts coming in for that conversation. Can I throw it back to Catherine and Shane, and perhaps you can elaborate and talk more about what some of the sub-schools might be doing to take wellbeing and that sense of re-engaging and reconnecting. What might some of the sub-schools be doing in that first week?
So certainly we see the first week as an opportunity to celebrate how successfully we as a community have managed remote learning. Mr Lewis is telling me to talk louder. Because it has been a real success. It was something that we were all thrown into the deep end with very little time to prepare, but as a whole community, we've managed that really well. So opportunities to re-engage, to talk about what we were successful at, what were our achievements, and opportunities to celebrate. So some fun things to help kids reconnect, some time in class to actually elaborate on what those successes are, and just to kind of re-engage with each other as a community. So that's something we'll be particularly looking at for year 11s and 12s, some way of acknowledging too some of the things that year 11 and 12 students have missed. So we'll be certainly looking at some ideas around what we can do in terms of the presentation ball not happening or the year 12 formal not happening, and some ways that we can move forward with those things.
And Shane, talk to us about some of the things that we might do to support the year 7s to 10s.
Yeah, I think one of the really big things for us, and this is still obviously in the early stages, but it's about having, creating opportunities for those conversations. What we've noticed as a school and what the feedback we've been receiving is from the students and from our parents, is that we've seen some really great relationships happening between our teachers and our students, and the ability they're connecting with each other and supporting each other. We want that to continue once we come back to school. So we want to create those chances within classes where the whole class can have those conversations. So, our teachers will take our students through that and just find out what they're feeling and how they see themselves working forward, so we can continue with our learning.
I might throw this one over to you, Mr. Lewis, as you take your spot back there in the hot seat. Question firstly from Abby about, are there any options of some more practical classes? I'm assuming she means 7 to 10 coming back any earlier. That's point number one. And then Tane's question, I think we answered it earlier about will year 11 and 12s come back and have half-hour periods?
No, so let's do Tane's first because it's the easy one. No, when you're back at school, you'll be running the normal school bell times, the normal school program. That's what will happen, and that's what we're going to go back to. So we're back to normal scenarios in that sort of case. In the other scenario, with more practical subjects for 7 to 10, really we're guided by the Department of Education, and they're telling us that we can only have years 11 and 12 and any year 10s who are doing a year 11 or 12 subject back in the next first 2 weeks. So that's really all we can have. We don't really have the option. There's not giving us options about what we can and can't do, or we could do this or we could do that. They're really being very definitive, and we need to go with the directive that issued by my supreme boss, the Minister for Education, and we're going to do exactly what he says, and so that's what we're going to be doing on it. So it's unfortunate. It would be great to have some of those practical classes back, but we'll need to go with what the Department of Education tells us to do, which is just 11s and 12s in that first 2 weeks.
And on that question, is there an option to stay home for the rest of the term?
Really, there's an option if you want to do that, if you really want to do that, but we won't be providing remote learning for those students. They would just be marked as absent from school, and they would need to catch up on the work that will be there up on Compass or their OneNote, as if they would be away sick. So a bit like if you're away having an operation, or you're having something of that sort of nature, you're unable to be at school because you're ill. If you're doing that, so really the Department of Education is saying that once school returns, that the remote learning program will cease and will go back to at-school learning, and you're expected to be at school doing that work in that way.
Yeah, so just I guess to reinforce what Andrew is saying there is we're not going to have two systems, remote learning and learning at school. When students are due back, depending on the year levels, they'll be expected to be at school. They won't be able to just make a decision to stay at home and have an expectation that we'll be providing work. The department's been really clear about that. The government's been really clear about that. It is very difficult to expect teachers to support students at home and support students at school as well. I might just come over to you, Miss Wallace. Perhaps you can talk about is social distancing going to be something that we're going to significantly consider for students?
So in all of our classrooms, we're going to be having sanitizer, and we're going to be asking students obviously to wash their hands, those same processes that they're already doing. In the classroom though, we won't be setting the tables up at 1.5 distance. It's too hard to manage, and we've been advised from our Chief Medical Officer that it's safe for students to be at school, so therefore it's safe for students to be in the classroom with each other. So they'll be able to engage in group work as per normal and have a normal classroom experience like it was before COVID-19. However, we will be putting extra cleaning measures in place to be able to ensure that the environment is as clean as possible, and we will be asking all students to practice safe cleaning of hands, etc.
Thank you. So I guess just to pick up on that point, because we had a follow-up question there from Shayla about Year 11, 12s who might share the same learning areas. We won't be making drastic changes in relation to socially distancing students. The advice from the Chief Health Officer is that students are safe to come to school, are safe to attend classes. Whilst we won't be having assemblies, we won't be having sport, we won't be having excursions, students are safe to study in the senior centre, they're safe to attend classes. A couple of questions, I'll throw it over to you, Ms Ford, about VET. We haven't specifically received communication in relation to VET, but I would guess our VET classes, so Spanish and Building and Construction, will be back when students resume the rest of their classes.
So the Montana College run VET classes have already had a system in place, and we've seen some of those students either operating online or coming in, particularly for carpentry. Different VET providers have different, but the plan has been through remote learning that students would be doing the theory base. But then once schools go back, VET will go back. So if your VET has had you not coming in for VET, the expectation, or our expectation, is that VET would be going back. But we have not yet been formally notified of that. We're just waiting on that now.
And the follow-up question there from Ebony, if you have a SAC scheduled on the Monday, that is the curriculum day, will that be postponed?
So we need to go back. We did all the planning around the SACs, Ebony, when we were thinking that we'd be out for all of term 2. We want to go back and have another look at those SACs, and we'll get back to you. But yes, it will be postponed if it is on that student free day. But we need to go back and have a look at that whole program that we've put in place, which we will be doing tomorrow.
Thank you. So just go your question there, Abby, about families that have students with compromised immune systems. It's a similar question that we've had from staff. The department's been pretty clear, and I mentioned it earlier. Effectively, once school returns, students are expected to be at school. And we'll do our best to try and support students where we can, but the current situation and current remote learning support that we're providing, we won't be able to continue to provide in the way that we currently are and do face-to-face teaching. So we're not ruling out being able to support students who may still have to continue at home, but I'll be very clear that the remote learning arrangements that are currently happening won't continue in their current form. Now, I might throw it back to you, Mr. Lewis. There's been a lot of talk in the media about staggered start times and staggered break times. Is that something that's going to impact us?
No. The short answer to that. We will not be doing staggered start times, and we will not be doing staggered break times. That really applies in short to primary schools or maybe small secondary schools who can manage it. But in our secondary school, we just don't have the capacity without completely restructuring our entire program and our staff to be able to have a staggered lunchtime in that way. We feel that we have enough spaces and enough areas around the school that we can still be able to have social isolation outside and to be able to do things in an appropriate manner without having to have a staggered lunch break or a staggered recess. We may be talking about doing some staggered starts and coming out for lockers, but we'll have a look at that. We'll talk about that and see what the situation is and how that goes. But certainly there will still be the same recess and lunch period for everyone.
Thank you. So Tracy, your question about VCE students and if they're unwell not being at school, will that affect their attendance? Well, as long as they've got a legitimate reason for not being at school, that won't negatively impact their attendance. But certainly if they are sick and they've got a SAC, they'll need to continue providing a medical certificate, which is our normal process. Just going back up here to a question we had earlier from, where are we? Manoj, about will there be temperature testing? No, there won't be temperature testing. Unfortunately, well, not fortunately or unfortunately, but our school site doesn't have a single or 2 or 3 entry points. We have multiples. With 1,500 students, it would be impossible to do that. But there will be temperature testing for students who may present as ill at the health centre. I'd encourage all parents to really support us by ensuring that any student who has the slightest symptoms of being ill not be sent to school. Any students that do get to school that are ill will be immediately sent home. Back to you, Ms Ford. This is questions from Tane. If a Year 10 student has an early start subject and a normal class in a double period, since the early start subject is now longer, will that take away time from the normal subject? I think we've answered this one already. It's how will you accommodate a VCE subject in the normal Year 10 timetable?
So, Tane, in the normal Year 10 timetable, it's only going to be an issue if that subject is period 4. So for period 4 subjects for remote learning, teachers will be doing the bulk of those subjects not live, so that information will be there for you to do. So if your subject is in period 3, the VCE subject is in period 3 and that rolls into period 4, then you'll have an opportunity at some point later to catch up on that that period 4 work. That will actually be there for you.
Gemma, your question about what's going to happen with students who need to take public transport. Well, look, effectively public transport's out of our control. It's not something that we deal with directly here. That's through Public Transport Victoria. As far as I'm aware, public transport will still operate and you'll catch that as you normally would if you're happy to do that. Obviously, you'll need to take precautions in terms of using hand sanitizer and maybe socially distancing if you need to, but public transport should be running as normal. Abby, your question, is it correct that if your child gets a cold, they must stay home? The short answer is absolutely. Unless you've been tested, there's no way to know the difference between a cold and having COVID-19. So in those circumstances, to be extra precautious for our whole community, we would ask that any student who is sick or has any symptoms of illness absolutely be kept home. I want to throw it over to you, Ms Wallace, not a question per se, but I know you want to give our parents a bit of an update. Recently you sent information out about assessment. What was that information about in terms of assessment, reporting? Do parents need to worry about their students being behind? What can they expect from teachers at the moment?
So parents and students don't need to be stressed about getting behind. So our remote learning is a really different program. It's unprecedented, and it's not an issue about getting behind at all. Our teachers will be going back over skills and doing different learning tasks to be able to teach skills that they think are really necessary in going forward. In saying that, our reports are looking differently this semester as well. We're not giving out grades, we're not grading our CAIs, and our CAIs won't be on reports at the end of semester. In saying that, the CAIs have been broken down often in lots of classes. So I know in English, for example, an essay has been broken down into 4 learning tasks, and that might present on Compass as looking like students have got more work. However, it's just the one task that may have been broken into 4 or 5 smaller tasks. We asked teachers to do that specifically so that there were smaller, more formative tasks that the students could work with, rather than having one big task that was going to be taking 3 or 4 weeks. We thought that would reduce stress for students. We are mindful though of that presents on Compass as possibly looking like they've got more work to do, whereas in actual fact, if you go into each of those tasks, they're much smaller tasks, and that's so our students could upload those tasks and our teachers could keep abreast of what's sort of happening and how much work our students are doing. So I just wanted to reiterate that again, that at the end of semester there won't be any CAIs on our end of semester report. There will be a Victorian curriculum level, and there will be no CAIs on the report. There will, however, be really quality feedback that's given to our students about where they are in their learning and what the next step of learning is. And we believe this is the key in assessment for going forward. So we'll be talking more about what assessment looks like in term 3 and how we're transitioning back to classroom face-to-face, but we'll leave that discussion for another day.
Thank you. Once again, another question on buses. As I said, we don't control buses, but I would expect at this stage that buses would absolutely run as normal. They're controlled by Public Transport Victoria. So I expect you can get some updates on that. Will all staff be going back on, is it the 25th? The 25th, yes. The 25th, that's a curriculum day. All staff are expected back at work. Classes for 11 and 12 start on the 26th, but all staff are expected to be back on site. So remote learning that's happening for Year 7, 8, 9 and 10 will be conducted by staff who will actually be at school, not at home. So that's the change there. But there'll be a different circumstance with some of our staff having to go through a combination of on-site learning and off-site or remote learning within the same day. Not something that we've discussed, Mr. Lewis, so I'm going to throw it to you without notice. But a few questions about music lessons and about ensembles. I imagine that for 11s and 12s, music lessons will probably happen when they come back in a couple of weeks, and for the rest, and probably the ensembles, they'll return when 7s to 10s come back.
I would have thought that both of those things are true, that Year 11 and 12 will be taking their normal lessons at their normal time, and that for 7s to 10s they'll pick up their lessons again in a direct learning system, apart from as opposed to the remote learning which the instrumental music lessons have been being done on when they come back. And that I would have thought that ensembles, we haven't really talked about it again, we're waiting for a bit of information again, but I would think that ensembles, apart from perhaps the largest of them, but certainly the majority of those ensembles, I think will be started working when the full school is back. So from the 6th, I think it's the 6th of, sorry, to the 9th, from the 9th of June, we'll be working with the ensembles and getting going back there. But we'll confirm that and put that out with some information on to the POPA information and through that information centre there.
Just quickly, Abby, your question once again about temperature checks, can they be done in home groups? We don't have any temperature checking devices at the moment. We've ordered 2. Mr. Lewis, how many home groups have we got?
59.
59 home groups. We certainly don't have the ability to be able to temperature check 59 home groups at this stage. So I'll go back to you.
In fact, the Premier this morning, or the Premier or the Minister, I forgot which one, has said that the temperature checks for students are not a good way of doing and detecting whether the COVID-19 virus is there and working on that. And so the medical advice is that whilst temperature checks are okay in some certain circumstances, they're not really appropriate for schools when they're returning. So working on the advice of the Minister and the Premier, and I'm sure the health advice that they're getting from the appropriate health professionals, that's really not something that we're looking to be doing. And from what the Premier said this morning, or the Minister, that we're not actually going to be given that information, that sort of equipment to be able to do that sort of work.
Yes, and as Olivia points out, there's no home groups for those Year 11s and 12s anyway. Olivia, back to your question. We've answered it a couple of times. Students who are in remote learning will continue on the remote learning timetable. Students that are at school will follow a normal timetable. Teachers will have work on there on campus, and you'll do that if you're in remote learning. You may not be able to contact your teacher though if they're teaching a Year 11 and 12 or Year 11 or 12 class at the time. I'm going to throw it to you. We're probably going to wrap up shortly. I'll throw to you, Ms. Ford, and I think you're probably trying to answer something on here whilst I throw it to you. But a question about, let me go back. There was a question there about SACs and particularly maybe if you can cover off what's happening with Year 10 and 11 mid-year exams and what VCAR have done in relation to Unit 2 and Unit 4 subjects for this year.
Okay, so I'll start with Year 10 and 11 exams, and Year 10 and 11 students might be relieved to hear that there will be no exams in semester 1 this year. So we will be doing them in semester 2, but semester 1 there won't be any. The second part of that question that I will cover, that I don't think we have covered clearly, is we've talked about Year 12 SACs. We haven't talked about Year 11 assessment items. And we have reviewed those, and they will be broken up.
Ms. Ford, do you want to just go over your answer there, I think, about the changes at the senior end?
So Unit 4, VCAR has revised all the study designs, and they've reduced the amount of content and the amount of assessment for those. They're in the process of reviewing the Unit 4 exams, and they will be announcing when the exam timetable occurs once all those exams have been reviewed. So we're hoping to hear what the exam timetable is hopefully next week, but yeah, we're still waiting on that. But Unit 3 subjects are all going ahead as planned in the study design. Those study designs haven't changed. The reason for that is because different schools are all in different places in terms of their assessment and the teaching of their content. So to change that now would actually be unfair. To accommodate what's actually happened for people, and I'm sure you know this already, but the Unit 3 has been extended by 2 weeks until the end of the year, until the end of the term. But we will also be looking at, because we've got a little bit of flexibility, of doing some of the final SACs in the first week of term 3, just to give people some extra time.
Thank you, Mr. Krug. A couple of questions about whether we would run our normal homework clubs or Maths Boost or Year 12 study sessions. Your thoughts?
Yes. So those programs within the school still have the ability to run. So Maths Boost and the later years study groups down in the senior centre will continue when we return to school. So you'll get further advice and information on that from those teams that run that once we get back.
Carrie, we're almost ready to wrap up, but the at-school program that has been happening for students currently, will that continue to run despite the fact that we now have a timetable to return to school?
So our remote learning on-site, our on-site program will be continuing to run until we have our full school back. So our program for our Year 7 to 10 students, I think it is at the moment we've got, they'll be continuing until the 9th of June, and then as of the 9th of June, all of our students from Year 7 to 12 will be together, and that's when we will transition back to a full normal timetable. But for those 2 weeks, the on-site program will run, and if any more students need to come and join that program in those 2 weeks because their parents have to go back to work, etc., then that program will be available for those students.
So just to cover off a couple of final questions there, Shadia, the orchard will run as normal, the uniform shop will be back open as normal. Chloe, will SACs that were rescheduled or scheduled in term 1 be completed? Teachers will work out what assessments need to be done and whether those that were scheduled early in the year need to be redone or broken into small parts. You'll expect further information from your teachers. I think we've covered it all. As I said, we are still waiting on lots of information from the department in relation to what is going to happen over the next couple of weeks and for the rest of this term. When we get that information, we will no doubt communicate to you as soon as we can. Thank you to the APs who joined us for today's session. And I thank you for joining in, and we will hopefully see all our students and teachers back at school really soon. Thank you, everyone.